Hi, I'm Chris Hughes, Chief Security Advisor at Endor Labs. You're back with another LeanAppSec, this time Fall 2024 edition, titled Back to the Basics of Application Security. Today, we're going to be having a talk about how to use compliance as a driver for application security. And today, I'm joined by Brandon Sterne. Brandon, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for folks that don't know you and don't know your background, can you tell us a bit about your background and the role you're in now?
Absolutely. I'm the CISO at Basis Theory, which is a developer-friendly platform that tokenizes and vaults sensitive data like credit cards for primarily merchants of all risk levels. And we work with brands to keep the burdens of PCI compliance from hitting them. That's kind of primarily what our platform does. And prior to here, I've had about a 20-year career in various enterprise security teams, mostly security engineering, AppSec, security operations, and I absolutely love this topic. I love this space and feel lucky to get to work in it.
Awesome. Yeah, you got quite the background. And you mentioned, I think you used the word burden when talking about compliance and development in AppSec teams, which many people associate, compliance with burden and frustration. And you'll even hear phrases like, compliance doesn't equal security and things like that. So I'm curious, in the role you're in now and in past roles, how have you helped balance the need for strict compliance while also helping teams, foster innovation and keep a high velocity when it comes to software development?
Yeah, that's really the question. I think that's, hopefully I have a view that I want to share and kind of get across here in this conversation, but, would love to hear from you and learn from your perspective as well, Chris. Yeah, I think that compliance gets a bad rap, if I can put it that simply. I think many developers and engineering and product teams have found frustration with compliance. They've maybe been involved in an audit process or controls demonstrations that can be manual and time consuming, and or maybe they've been asked to build something solely to fill a compliance gap, which to them, feels not core to their business or to their role. So yeah, I think compliance can be seen that way, or maybe even is seen that way frequently. And as security teams, we really have an opportunity to reframe that and to say, you mentioned, Chris, compliance does not equal security. Well, sure, I think that's a true statement, and we can sort of pick and choose specific examples where the two things don't overlap. But ideally, as we work forward and build maturity and automation and streamline these processes, more and more those two worlds do overlap. And we don't have to burden people with this manual kind of one-off building. What I would say is compliance is quite simply saying what you do and doing what you say, and then being able to kind of demonstrate that fact. And if you're doing good things from a security perspective, then you can demonstrate that, and you can achieve all of your compliance and security goals at the same time.
Yeah, I like the framing of, doing what you say and saying what you do, because it kind of speaks to, we've also heard, how security can be a business enabler and sometimes even compliance, right? When it comes to showing what frameworks you align with, what certifications you've achieved, so in your role and in past roles, like how do you look at, using compliance, for example, and cybersecurity more broadly as a business enabler, for example, because that can often get more buy-in from development teams, engineering teams, the business more broadly, because they can tie it to, revenue, existing revenue or potential revenue, things like that. So how do you kind of approach that?
Yeah, I saw a talk fairly recently by Travis McPeak. He's of Resourcely and other security teams, and he gave a talk about things your CISO won't tell you. And I think the reality, which can be painful sometimes for security teams to hear, but is that compliance is more important than security in the sense that compliance is what sells the product. This is what opens doors to new customers. This is what allows your customers' vendor security teams to get on board and approve the onboarding of your product, of your service. And ultimately, security is the mission for our teams. This is why we're here. We're here to protect the company and its customers and its information assets. But if we're not able to sell the product and acquire new customers and acquire revenue, it's really all somewhat pointless, right? We're here and we get a paycheck because our business is a going concern. And we're making money. We're acquiring customers. So, in a very real sense, the priority has to be on compliance in the sense that these certifications are the thing that opens the door for the business. And just to tie it back to the point I made at the top, if we're doing the right work, if we're doing our jobs carefully, we can do both at the same time. But I think Travis's point, and it's one I agree with, is that we can't lose the framing, we can't lose the importance that these certifications that we maintain are actually mission critical. And there's maybe, we might be able to have some flexibility or be deprioritize some of the security work that all of us as practitioners are passionate about and need to be there for the good of the business. What we just can't lose the perspective that compliance can actually drive business, and that's an opportunity we should all take. So frequently security can be easily painted as a pure cost, or it's just as a cost center. And in fact, if you look at it this other way, where security is allowing us to maintain these compliance certifications, that security is a revenue center. We are driving the business. We're expanding the customer trust in our product, in our platform, and that's actually that's an opportunity we should all take.
Yeah, I love the perspective that you brought from Travis of losing perspective of, and I wrote an article recently called "Cybersecurity's Delusion Problem," and in that I talk about we have this. Some practitioners have this skewed perspective that cybersecurity is all that matters or should be the most pressing risk to the business, the only, the most critical risk that they consider. And I tried to make the case that, it's a critical risk. It matters, right? We care about security quite a bit and we want the business to care about it, but they have other considerations too, like things like revenue, speed to market, customer attraction and retention. If you can't, like you said, if you can't make money as a business, if you can't, make payroll and so on, like that's a pretty pressing risk that may be more pressing than cybersecurity, depending on the size of the organization and what you have going on. And often in security, we tend to just think of just security as the only risk the business is juggling, when in reality, it's one of many, and it's often not the most critical. It may be in some cases, depending on, the situation, an incident, an exploit, something that impacted the organization, but it's not the only risk. And I think sometimes in security, we lose sight of that. One thing you're also really passionate about is, the concept of continuous compliance services, monitoring services, for example, and, the value that can bring to things like the secure software development lifecycle and real security value, rather than just checking boxes on a dashboard, things like that.
Right.
What is your perspective when we look at like continuous compliance monitoring, for example?
Yeah, I think many of us have one of these compliance automation and monitoring products in place in our business, And I've used all of them. I think they largely, they differ around the margins, but a lot of them offer similar functionality, and it's really important, really valuable to be able to have a kind of heads up dashboard for which of my controls are operating, are healthy, and where maybe something turned yellow or turned red today. That gives me something that I can go work on. It's actionable. So without kind of endorsing any one of them, I'd say it's a really good investment. And even if you have a small security team with few resources, one of those products is probably a good investment to make. You don't get it for free. You've got to there's wrench time, and you have to make sure all of the integrations are working so that your evidence collection flows in and can be verified. But I'd also say there's open source and free products and frameworks that are available as well if there's truly limited resources. And one I want to mention is Secure Controls Framework. And I think I've found in my own career and in my own work and trying to manage these GRC programs, something like Secure Controls Framework gives you a really simple way to cross-map all the various compliance frameworks that you may be pursuing in your business, and be able to see where these controls overlap and where evidence can be reused across the several certifications, and just provides a really useful way to kind of organize all of that. And just to, again, connect, this is a point I just really feel strongly about, right? If we're saying that compliance is about saying what we do and doing what we say, right? We have an opportunity with one of these compliance automation tools, GRC tools, to make sure that our policies are clear and reflect what we actually do, right? I think policy sets can kind of grow organically over time, and not always in the most rational, intentional way. So give us a way to kind of have a view of all of that, manage it, and make sure they're reflecting what we actually do. And then on the flip side, in the doing what we say, having an opportunity to have reusable security controls that are standard, right? That everybody in the business, all the stakeholders understand what is our standard for this, and that we are it's not the security team coming in and saying, hey, this is my opinion about what you should be doing. This is the standard. We all agreed to this, and we're either following the standard, and great, then it's a really short conversation, or we're not. And if we're not, then we can have a conversation about why not, and do we have a good reason? And so security teams that are mature and efficient are providing ways for the business to have reusable implementations, to have guardrails in place that let the business just take the standard, or take a tool or a service that just implements the standard for them. And again, it just shortens the conversation. It's the paved road. It's the golden path that we're all looking to implement in our security programs.
Yeah, you've used that word reuse and concepts like paved road and guardrails and things like that a couple times now. So I wanted to ask, in your experience, what have you seen successful on that front? Being a little bit more specific or tactical on that topic. For me, I've seen a lot of efforts around platform engineering and standing up, say hardened infrastructures and environments, like building on top of cloud native services, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, even leveraging external software as a service that may be compliant with certain frameworks. For example, things like hardened infrastructure as code and landing zones that are already mapped to compliance frameworks. And really leaning into the cloud shared responsibility model in
Yes.
terms of inheriting controls from cloud service providers and their services, and then kind of narrowing down what development teams, engineering teams, what they need to focus on, what they're either fully responsible for, or what controls they may share as a shared responsibility with the the cloud provider or software provider, for example. In your experience, what type of things have you seen be successful in terms of those paved roads, those guardrails, that reusability that you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, you touched on a few really good ones already there. So just to kind of agree with some of your points, Chris, infrastructure as code, I think, has just been a absolute win, right, for security teams and being able to stamp out and reuse known good patterns, for our infrastructure. There's so many ways that we can, use infrastructure as code, and then use a lot of the security tools that have come into practice for securing our source code, and CI/CD pipelines can now be applied as well to our infrastructure. So it's really been it's been a revelation. Huge step forwards in terms of our ability to have predictable, standard infrastructure deployed, that we don't have to worry about having some misconfigurations or one-off settings that can put our infrastructure at risk. So IAC is a huge one. As well, just some of the reusable kind of guardrails that I've seen be successful are cryptography, right? So for data protection, for data security and encryption, we really don't want to expose all of the sharp edges that crypto systems can have, or do have, if you're operating them at a very low level. Being able to hide all the sharp edges, being able to abstract those away, and be providing very simple, developer-friendly APIs in a crypto utils library. I've seen implemented at many of the places I've worked that again take away those sharp edges, and just give development teams a reusable kind of toolkit to do crypto operations, and just not have to think too hard about ways they can get into trouble. And then having a single shared implementation is easier from a security testing and auditability perspective as well. It's just kind of simplifies things for everybody. And then as well, OWASP top 10 types of issues. Many of these compliance frameworks that we're talking about here recognize OWASP, and if we can do things at the framework level for applications, to whatever your programming languages or web app frameworks that may be in use, being able to provide reusable libraries and services that do the kind of sanitization and other kinds of OWASP top 10 risks, be able to address those at a framework level, are really, really valuable, and save developers from having to think too much about the details. And if you can give them those guardrails, they can spend more time thinking about the core business and what their, the value proposition of their products and services are. I will say that I think I've seen as, I've been in this game for a little while now, and I think I have seen maybe an over-reliance now on some of these frameworks, some of these security libraries that handle a lot of this OWASP top 10 kinds of issues for the developers, and such that SQL injection and cross-site scripting, other kinds of content injection attacks aren't as prevalent anymore, haven't made the news maybe as much, and maybe the average understanding in our development communities, I think has potentially gone down over the last maybe five plus years. And so I see as well the need just to make sure, I think we can hand our developers reusable security tools that let them address these issues, by default, but let's not, let's also take the opportunity to provide good, relevant, secure coding training as well, just so they know what is the kinds of issues that are being handled for them. So it's not completely mystical, what is happening behind the scenes of those security libraries that we're giving them. So I think there's a balance to be struck there, but obviously giving people these guardrails, letting them go fast while still being safe is a really good way to kind of meet our compliance goals while also helping the business and having security team be an enabler.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, you also raised a great point of not just the underlying platforms and infrastructure as code and things like that, but IDE integrations, pipeline tooling that can help identify, misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, compliance deviations. Those are all, of course, great things I've seen be successful as well, and minimize, the frustration of having to go fix something once it's in production and untangle it and things like that. And kind of speaks to the, the shift left mantra that we've seen take hold the last several years, although that has its own challenges too, of course. One thing that you mentioned earlier was the secure controls framework, and kind of crosswalking between different compliance frameworks, and understanding what you've already implemented, maybe perhaps underneath one framework that you don't need to redo again underneath a new framework. And it kind of speaks to the complexity of the compliance and regulatory landscape, which is only growing more complex, in my opinion, with new frameworks. You have so many now: HIPAA, HITRUST, FedRAMP, SOC 2, and they just keep coming and coming, right? What are your thoughts on the current lay of the land when it comes to the compliance landscape and just its general complexity at the moment, or where it may be headed?
Yeah, I think that this is a really tough question for, I think, especially smaller companies, right? Where I'm particularly facing this now. I'm working in this startup environment. We have a much smaller security and compliance team, and the regulatory complexity that faces these businesses grows every year, and there are new frameworks, coming into being that may be attractive for the business to pursue, to be able to acquire customers in a new region or in a new market. And so it's really really requires a process of prioritization, of ruthless prioritization, to understand the complicated math that says, what will we have to do? What are the deltas between where we are today, and what are the gaps that we have that would need to be filled to allow us to go pursue that new framework, and then be able to see how many of those gaps address that not only this one additional framework, but maybe the next one and the one after that, and being able to just have a sensible roadmap, to understand how much effort is going to be required, how much of that effort can be reused across these new frameworks, And then all while still maintaining, our existing, all of the existing frameworks that we have, certifications we have today require maintenance as well. We don't have unlimited resources. And so tools like Secure Controls Framework, the Cloud Security Alliance has a similar framework that helps do this cross-walking between them. These are invaluable. If you've got a small security and compliance team like I have, there's a lot of that work is being done for you to understand, where you may have gaps, where you may have control gaps, where you may have evidence gaps, and then being able to kind of put together a sensible roadmap for what order we want to go pursue these in. I can't recommend them enough for being able to do that. But I agree with your general, the point that your question makes, which is the growing complexity across this landscape is only accelerating. And we have to have a strategy. We have to have tools in place to help us manage that complexity.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, something to throw out there, the Office of the National Cyber Director earlier this year had put something out about trying to push for regulatory harmonization, just because they've heard so much pushback from industry of, hey, it's a lot, there's so many compliance frameworks, the requirements keep coming, we need help. The problem there is, of course, it's the government, and things tend to move very slow, and could even have unintended consequences sometimes, as we see in regulation. So I'm interested to see where that one will go, but hopefully in a good direction, and kind of bring some relief to navigating the compliance framework landscape. One thing I wanted to ask you about too, you talked about kind of tools that can shift left and enable secure outcomes for developers. Historically there often is a bit of a tension between development teams and security teams. Development teams often view compliance as just like a headache, kind of a pain in the butt to deal with, where compliance or security teams may view it as a measure of implementing risk management. How do you kind of historically in your role now and in the past, how do you kind of get past that and get development teams on board with aligning with compliance requirements?
Yeah, I think that by and large we can assume people want to do the right things, right? And by that I mean people want the business to be secure. We're not at a point that we were 10 or 15 years ago, where people needed to be convinced that security is a worthwhile thing to have in our business. Just looking at the news, right, we can see the major, frequent, and growing impacts that security breaches are having for businesses and in the economy. And so people get it, right? You don't need to really convince them that everything else being equal, security is something that we want to have here. It's just a matter that people have, 15 other competing priorities, items that they're responsible for delivering this week or this month. And how am I going to find the time to do that, to do all that security stuff? Oh, and then on top of that, have to go do compliance controls, compliance audits, and fill out all the paperwork, as they might say it, right? Cynically, do all this paperwork on top of that. Where am I going to find the time to do it? And I think the big idea, something that I've learned over the last just few years, I think the thing that has helped me navigate that and get some leverage over that situation is to reframe the security controls and the requirements that we have in building them to include from the beginning the evidence layer. Right? To say we're actually not done. It's updating the definition of done in building the security controls, which we already agreed we are going to have these. We need them. It's updating our definition of done to say it includes the production of evidence that it's operating correctly. And so it's a functional requirement now of the project in the first place that the evidence layer is part of that. And most of these compliance frameworks that we're talking about are not, prescriptive about what you need to build specifically. It's just that there's a particular risk, right, that the compliance framework wants you to have a control and coverage for. And you just have to show how your solution is meeting that. So we don't have to be, the requirements aren't dictated to us, just kind of a basic outline of what we need. We get to decide what we're going to build. And then we just we scope it into the project that we are going to build the production and collection of evidence as part of this. And so long as, the evidence flows in, we can build our GRC around, collecting it, reporting on it. We can build that dashboard, right? And we just we don't have to, again, we get to go back to that merging of the two worlds. Security and compliance don't have to be separate things. The compliance is just simply the ability to show that the security controls we've built are operating effectively. And again, across these different frameworks, we've got these cross mappings now. We can reuse that evidence and really get rid of a lot of the manual work that auditing entails historically. We can just produce it all, and we can kind of reuse it and kill two birds with one stone.
So you made a comment earlier about competing incentives or competing priorities, right? Development teams may have. It made me think of something. We've seen a big push recently around secure by design, secure by default. Obviously, most notably being pushed by CISO, but others as well. Industry organizations have rallied around it. Even one of the largest organizations in the industry, saying that security is going to be a top priority on par with other considerations, and even be baked into compensation or incentives for executives, right? After some pretty visible, notable security incidents that they experienced. Not to name any names, but I'm curious your thoughts on the secure by design push that we've been seeing in the industry, and where do you see that headed? Do you see any challenges there, given that the business does have other things to consider? Obviously we want security to be a first top priority, but maybe it can't be in some cases, as we talked about with a broader business concerns, for example. So what are your thoughts around secure by design more broadly, and just the industry push around that?
I think the secure by design requirements and pledges that many of the organizations are taking are good, and that they point us in a good direction. Those are best practices that we should all be following, and hopefully are. I think that I'm a bit maybe skeptical that will really have the impact. Taking the pledge is one thing. It doesn't cost very much for me to take a pledge. I think that if we are really serious about seeing the results in having critical software applications have fewer vulnerabilities and have fewer breaches over time, there's going to need to be enforcement. Frankly, there has to be some consequence. There has to be something to the regulation that we are, we're imposing, to where it's actually painful to not follow the regulation. And I think we've been talking about, software liability and cyber insurance, and those are sectors are really maturing and growing quickly, at least on the cyber insurance side. On the liability side, I think it's very unlikely that businesses will change their behavior until there's financial, or in some cases now personal liability. on behalf of the officers of the companies. Until that happens, I think taking pledges directionally is good and points us in the right direction, but that I will wait to see. I'm somewhat skeptical that we're going to see any behavior change until there's some real teeth, until there's a negative consequence that's on the other side of not following the guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, I was over here laughing on mute for those watching, because I agree with you, right? Like, I think the pledge is a great thing. It's a good sign of good intention, but that doesn't mean actual effort, outcomes, investment, and so on. And I think, like you said, out until there's sufficient either market forces or regulatory forces that drive behavior change, I don't think that we'll see systemic changes at a broad scale. But it does open the question up, to the concept that, one last piece around, compliance is we've seen a lot of language recently around things like software liability, which made a presence in the latest U.S. National Cyber Strategy, for example. Of course, with the counterpart of software or safe harbor, I should say, for organizations that have done, sufficient due diligence around security. What are your thoughts around, software liability, safe harbor, where that may be headed, and how do we even navigate it, given that we don't have a good universal agreement of what secure actually is, or how much security is enough security, for example?
That's a really hard question. I think you're pointing to the problem is that the last thing you said there, Chris. It's that we don't have an agreed upon definition of what is secure software or what is secure enough. We have some best practices that have emerged over the handful of decades that software engineering has even been a discipline, right? We've been building bridges and other structures for centuries, if not millennia. We have a long history of those engineering practices that have told us what's a good practice and what's a bad practice, and we have building codes and other kinds of agreed upon engineering standards for those things. We've been building software for 40 or 50 years. We are still learning. We're still making a lot of mistakes. So while I think agree that some kind of software liability would be the right way to align incentives and to influence behaviors, it's just going to be very hard. We're just not yet at a point where we can say if a business has done enough, if they have done followed the right standards and have been good stewards of the resources and have essentially done enough to avoid liability. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you, Chris. What is it going to take? Like, what would it take for us to be able to live in a world where there is where software liability can be applied and have the kind of positive impact we're both looking for?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a tough one. I wish I had a quick 30-second answer I could throw out there of hey, here's exactly what we need to do. But I've written and spoken about this quite a bit in the sense that, when it comes to security, we don't even have a universal agreement of what secure is. There's a lot of nuance and, ambiguity around responsibilities between people using the software, people consuming the software, people who made the software, a lot of things that need to change when we look at end user licensing agreements, for example, and liability for people that produce software, and then who will validate that the vendor did the things they said they did without introducing some heavy-handed kind of third-party, assessment regime, for example, which brings its own challenges. So these are, and not only that, but do we end up, actually creating more problems than we have now by introducing a heavy-handed, bureaucratic liability regime, which actually impedes innovation, right? And that's something to consider too. Just throwing this out there, looking at the EU and AI, for example, they have the EU AI Act, and they're taking a much more rigorous approach than the US with the AI executive order and voluntary pledges and things we see here. But they also don't have a footprint with notable AI startups. They have companies like Apple, for example, not intending to release AI intelligence for Apple in the EU because of regulatory requirements. So there's give and take, there's trade-offs to be considered, and it's a very complex, challenging problem that's going to require input from both security practitioners, software development, development organizations, lawyers. It's a tough one. So I wish there was an easy answer on that. I guess last question, as we're heading to the Q&A here and running out of time. When we look at the current landscape and what do you think will happen in the next few years around compliance? And we've went through a lot of topics of guardrails, platform engineering, secure controls framework, and kind of rationalizing different security controls and things like that. What are the most tangible likely things to happen in the AppSec space around compliance and things you would like to see happen, I guess I'd say, in terms of driving AppSec forward as with compliance as a driver, for example?
I would say that automation has to be the thing that takes us forward. And we see lots of vendors that are doing really innovative things in this space. And there's many kind of commercial solutions that are out there that can help us navigate the complexity that you pointed to earlier, Chris. All of the various competing and new security and compliance frameworks coming into the picture. Automation has to be at the kind of centerpiece of our strategy to stay ahead of this. And that just to go back to my last point about producing evidence, right? I think that is ultimately the main thing we have to think about in anything that we're building, from a security perspective. Your security engineering teams should just reframe this as, let's make it easy on ourselves, right? We're doing all this hard work, to build these controls to solve real security problems. Let's just take it a little bit farther and make things transparent and make things, self-evidently working correctly. And that if we can kind of automate that side of the picture, then we'll be able to stay ahead of it, even with small resource constrained teams. Whether you're doing your various software security lifecycle problems or change management, like all of these domains can benefit from having this approach where we are just showing the evidence and producing that in a way that's very transparent and verifiable to our auditors and to all our stakeholders. I'd say if there's one thing, if there's one theme that if I was going to make a prediction, it would just be that automation is going to take over this space, and I'd say get on board that train as soon as you can.
Yeah, you're speaking my language on a few fronts. I wrote a book a couple of years ago now titled Software Transparency. So I'm a big advocate of that, providing that transparency just not only between, vendors of software and customers and consumers, but also, as you point out, between organizations producing software and, auditors or assessors and things like that. And, historically, when we look at compliance, we've lived in static, snapshot in time based assessments, Word, Excel, PDF, you name it. And we're living in the age of DevOps, APIs, microservices, and automation, CI/CD pipelines, et cetera. We should be automating a lot of these controls away with cloud native services, with APIs, with pipeline tooling and things of that nature. And I think, many organizations are already starting to try to head in that direction. Some of the organizations I work with are doing that now. And I think that's where we're headed. It'll free folks up from doing some of that, kind of historical shoulder surfing, screenshots, static documentation, things like that, to, real, driving secure software development forward and just having a more, more freedom to kind of engage with development teams, understand what they're building, how they're building it, how it's architected, how it's compliant, how it's deficient in terms of compliancy, how can we fix it? So yes, to everything you said about automation, I think that's going to be the direction of the future of compliance, and that'll take us to Q&A. So thanks so much for jumping on here.
All right, thank you so much for that, Brandon. I think Chris is having some technical issues to join. Yeah, so I think while you and I chat a little bit, Anthony, if you want to go grab a coffee, I just did, so feel free. And I also saw a comment from Chris from earlier about watching Doctor Who last night, and I wanted to call his attention to the TARDIS tattoo I have here on my arm. Brandon, I want to pick up right where you left off with Chris and ask you something about automation. You said that your main prediction is that automation is going to be at the heart of really the future of how compliance interacts with security. Can you double click a little bit on what that means for specifically for application security? Like which process would you like to see automated, or you think teams should be focused on automating?
Well, the obvious ones that come to mind are around, kind of code level and dependency level security, right? Kind of SAST, SCA, this vulnerability management, kind of the detection and patching of vulnerabilities. Right, we're still, I think we've made good strides. Tools are getting better. There's a long way to go, and in helping make sure that the signal that's coming from those tools is actionable for teams, and that we're not inundating teams with a huge amount of toil work just to stay on top of that volume. But as well, like there's Chris mentioned screenshots, right? I think we've all been. I'm just surprised that in 2024, like audits still heavily involve people shoulder surfing and taking screenshots and manually walking people through the operation of different processes of different controls. And so I think it's to me it's all about kind of the producing evidence. Can we develop some reliable and more to the point, trustworthy for auditors and for stakeholders pipelines, evidence collections pipelines, right? I still think the industry needs to mature a little bit such that they can trust maybe the chain of custody, if that's how we could refer to it. How we're collecting this evidence, how we're presenting it in a way that just lets us quickly verify things that are working correctly. But yeah, I would say, right, like I think for this audience, right, this AppSec and those the SCA and kind of SAST and DAST and some of these frameworks can get a lot better and can increase the signal to noise ratio that we're producing for engineering teams that have to respond to us.
Yeah, I like Catherine was also just commenting about this, but I like this idea of an evidence collecting pipeline. I do have Chris's book right here, his first book, Software Transparency, which talks about this, and specifically in the context of generating SBOMs, but SBOMs that are actually useful. I think a lot of people usually equate an SBOM to the ingredients list on the back of like a food item, but in reality, it's not really like that at all, because the SBOM is constantly changing, right? So every time you run a pipeline, you would have to regenerate it to see which dependencies you have, and also pair it with a VEX document that tells you, hey, if I have a vulnerability here, here's the one that is reachable or unreachable, or why did I not address it? I'm interested, since you've run teams at companies big and small, and I'm assuming that in some of these companies, compliance was a bigger issue than others. We had a comment earlier about regulated spaces versus non-regulated spaces. Do I care about FedRAMP? Do I care about PCI? How much did you invest in educating practitioners, so application security engineers, the individual contributors, in really understanding these standards? Like, does an application security engineer need to understand, continuous monitoring in the context of FedRAMP, or do you think that's the job of the director and the CISO?
Yeah, I saw that comment. So David Peach made this comment. I think it's a really an important one, right? If maybe you're working in a more or less regulated space, and maybe the more regulated, the higher the value of these compliance frameworks, right? But I think the point I took from David's comment is maybe it's not the compliance certification that your customers are demanding, right? And I think that's the thing that we need to be responsive to. I think maybe my comments in my session with Chris are making the assumption that what customers want are the compliance certifications, right? I think maybe that's not a universal assumption that we can make, but that, right, the security and compliance teams should just be responsive to what our customers are asking for. That's ultimately what I'm saying there. And that I think to answer maybe your question, Ron, a little more directly, it should be as little as possible that we are talking to engineering and product teams about specific compliance frameworks. They shouldn't have to think about that. They shouldn't have to know about, the kind of gory details of any particular compliance requirement. We should have an ability to translate compliance language into engineering requirements. That is not easy, by the way. It's not a trivial thing. I've seen some people who are really good at that. That's an incredibly valuable skill to have. Like, we should all be trying to hire those people who can do that abstraction and sort of, remove any of the obscure, heavily compliance driven language and recast those or translate those to just engineering requirements. And then it becomes much easier to just, again, reuse that control across various frameworks. That is the dream, is to be able to speak in kind of engineering terms to those audiences, and less so in the pure compliance terms.
Yeah, and here we have Chris with us as well. Just in time, because Chris, when you and I met at RSA, I met a lot of people at RSA. We had talked about exactly one of the items that you and Brandon touched upon, which was the Secure by Design framework, and we were wondering, like, does it have any teeth, right? So does it actually enforce anything and change anything? Because if I'm an application security engineer and I'm measured in my job by either how many vulnerabilities do I fix, or how secure is the code that I'm shipping, but my engineering counterparts are rewarded for something else completely, and I don't have a layer above me that says, okay, here's how I translate this language that says you must address all vulnerabilities. What does address mean to engineering requirements? Then really nothing happens. So it sounds like you're not really seeing movement in that direction, that anything that gives Secure by Design more teeth, or are you seeing more companies actually adopt it now?
So I think it's a mixed bag. Like, I think it's obviously, inherently we know it's the right thing to do. And it's like, companies are voluntarily signing this pledge, but the key word there is voluntarily. And, there's nothing abiding, like, even if they don't, no one's like, no third party is going to come after them and actually validate that they've done the things in the pledge. And if it becomes an incident where that, they don't, something happens and it turns out they didn't do something that was in the pledge, I don't know that there'll be any consequences rather than just some negative PR and blowback, right? I wrote an article where I kind of call it the Scout's honor, because we're giving our word that we're going to do these things. And I think it's an effort by CISA, bound by their limited power to regulate, to say, hey, we're trying to drive things forward. We're trying to get people to do the right thing and, do the secure thing from the start, secure by design, secure by default. But it's not, software liability. It's not regulation. They're not bound by it. And I think that's kind of the issue with it, is like, it's ultimately, it's a step in the right direction. It's trying to get people to do the right thing. It's encouraging and so on, but it's not a forcing function per se. And I think that's where it falls flat. But then again, on the like Brandon and I have talked about, is like, if we move to the next level of liability, well, what does that look like? And like, what do you have to do, and who's going to validate it? And how do we do that without stifling innovation and all that? So it's a double-edged sword for sure.
And at what point does it become too scary, to even take the job? right?
Right.
If liability is behind every corner, but also at different levels. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's not FedRAMP, right? Where it's like, hey, if you don't have it, you can't sell to us. And lo and behold, everybody is rushing to be compliant because like the stick works better than the carrot.
Well, speaking of FedRAMP, Ron, I mean, just to pick up on your question, right, which is, well, what does it mean to address these vulnerabilities, right? I think that's an opportunity we have. The security team needs to clarify that with all of the internal stakeholders, with engineering. What do we mean by that? Because as some of the commenters in this chat were saying, you know, depending on what, if it's FedRAMP or if it's PCI or, you know, somewhere in between on the spectrum, you have a lot less flexibility with FedRAMP, for example, than you do with PCI, and maybe your particular compliance certs give you more flexibility, and you can take that risk-based approach that somebody was commenting about, and you can, you know, you can prioritize things a bit differently. You can buy yourself more time to do things. If you're in FedRAMP high, the flexibility just gets, you know, vanishingly small. But in whatever case you're in, it's incumbent on the security team to be clear with what do we mean by address them, and just so everybody, you don't surprise people.
And yeah, to Brandon's point, you know, it's you know, compliance, as we talked about, is like a good forcing function. It's often a broad brush, and there's not a lot of nuance or context there. So a lot of these compliance frameworks haven't gotten very granular quite yet around exploitability and reachability and like actual business risk impact. So often it kind of comes down to an exercise of building that rapport with the auditors or assessors and kind of explaining, hey, this is actually not relevant because of this reason, just because it's a CVSS critical or whatever. Like trying to walk them through that and help them understand that, you know, is a great way to kind of help them understand, you know, why things matter, how to prioritize, you know, things that are true findings versus, you know, just going by simply what the language says with no nuance or context or, you know, information related to the actual system and the context of the system.
Yeah. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I need to keep us going towards the next session. I just want to call out, you can find both Brandon and Chris on LinkedIn, and they might be hanging out with us in the chat for a little bit. I really do recommend, you know, Chris is a friend, and we do some work together, but I really do recommend these books because I've read both, and they've certainly helped me understand this space better and like develop more empathy towards application security specifically, and just understand the space better. So really, really amazing resources, as well as his podcast at Resilient Cyber, and the website. So thank you so much. I hope we'll see you on the next LeanAppSec as well.